Okay, strap in, because today we are diving deep into Gustave Le Bon's The Crowd. This is going to be fascinating, and I have a feeling you wanted to go beyond just a simple summary of this book.
You're right. Going beyond the surface level is exactly what we are going to be doing today. Le Bon's work on crowd psychology, even though it was written in the late 1800s, is shockingly relevant even now.
Right. It really makes you think. So much has changed since then, but when you look at those core ideas about how people think and act when they are part of a group, well, it's like holding up this dusty old mirror to society, isn't it?
Exactly. It's amazing how many of Le Bon's observations about how being part of a crowd changes individual thinking still hold true today, both for the good and the bad.
I've got to say, even dipping my toes into the first few sections, I'm already seeing what you mean. He talks about this collective soul of a crowd, and it's kind of eerie how people get swept up in these shared beliefs, even if those beliefs don't really have a leg to stand on.
And that's precisely one of the things that fascinated Le Bon. It's like a crowd takes on a life of its own, becoming something more than just the sum of its parts with a distinct psychology separate from the individuals who make it up. And you're right, those shared beliefs can be based on anything from rational thought and evidence-based reasoning to, well, illusions.
That's like those emperor's new clothes situations, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Where everyone is going along with something because it's the thing to do, even if they secretly have their doubts.
Precisely. Le Bon talks about the power of what he calls contagion in a crowd. Emotions and even behaviors can spread like wildfire. They're almost like a virus moving through a population.
So this contagion makes crowds incredibly vulnerable to manipulation, especially when you have a leader who knows how to play on those shared emotions.
Exactly. Whether it's preying on people's fears or appealing to their desires or even just tapping into prejudice that's already there.
And he seems to suggest that it doesn't matter how educated you are. Even the most highly educated individuals, once they become part of a crowd, are more likely to be influenced. It's a bit unnerving, don't you think?
You're hitting on one of Le Bon's most intriguing points. Education doesn't equal rationality, especially not when it comes to crowds. He argues there are even situations where more education might make people more susceptible to manipulation.
Especially maybe when those highly educated people feel like they aren't being listened to, or that the system is failing them in some way.
Precisely, and that is exactly where the role of leaders comes in. It's something that Le Bon really dives into in his work.
It's a fascinating section of the book, for sure. He seems to believe that some people just have this inherent it factor, this sort of natural charisma or prestige that makes them incredibly persuasive, especially to crowds. Didn't he use Napoleon as an example?
He did. Le Bon seemed to be captivated by these figures that he referred to as leaders of crowds, and he dedicated a significant portion of his work to unpacking how these leaders acquire and then utilize their influence. But you're right, it's not about military strength or anything like that. It's much more psychological. Some people just seem to have this intangible power over others.
And it's not just about having that it factor either. He also talked about specific strategies that these leaders use. Things like repetition or strong imagery, anything that really sticks with you long after you've heard it.
Exactly. There's like those political slogans that get stuck in your head, even if you don't support the politician who came up with them.
Exactly. They're designed that way.
Right. And Le Bon was writing during a time when understanding how to persuade large groups of people was becoming increasingly important, and his work was groundbreaking in that it broke down the mechanics of persuasion, explaining how appealing to emotion, simplifying language, and repeating core messages were incredibly effective ways to exert influence over a crowd.
And he actually called out some of these tactics directly, right? Like using what he called affirmation, which is just repeating the same thing over and over, and contagion, which is this idea that emotions are infectious.
Yes. And while he might not have used today's terminology, his observations are shockingly relevant to things we see everywhere, every day, from propaganda to marketing, and even just the way things play out on social media.
You know, it really makes you think because it's almost like our brains are hardwired to be influenced this way, especially in large groups.
That's one of the things that makes Le Bon's work so compelling, and let's be honest, a little bit frightening.
Yeah.
It suggests that our vulnerability to this kind of crowd influence is deeply ingrained in our psychology.
Like it's hardwired into us.
Right, potentially even a holdover from our evolutionary past.
It's pretty wild when you think about it. Our world now with social media and this constant barrage of advertising and the 24/7 news cycle, it's almost as if we're all living in one giant psychology experiment.
I think that's a pretty accurate way to look at it, actually. I think that Le Bon's work serves as a very potent reminder that while crowds can be incredibly powerful agents of change, they can also be incredibly vulnerable to manipulation. They can be led to make decisions that aren't in their best interest at all.
And Le Bon doesn't just talk about crowds in a general sense either. He gets into specifics. He talks about criminal crowds, juries, even voters.
Right, he sees crowd psychology at play in all these different aspects of society.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
It's like no group is immune.
Exactly, and that's one of the things that makes his work so relevant even today, more than a century after he wrote it. He argues that all of these seemingly disparate groups, when they come together as a crowd, they display very similar patterns in their psychology.
He's not pulling any punches either when he talks about how susceptible these groups are to manipulation, or how often the choices they make are based more on emotion than they are on logic. Like, he uses the example of juries being swayed by a witness who's crying on the stand or by a group of experts, even if their testimony isn't all that reliable when you look at it objectively.
Right, and he connects those different types of crowds by looking at them through this lens of shared psychology, right? So he's saying that it doesn't really matter what the context is, whether you're talking about a courtroom or a political rally or even just a group of friends. The basic psychological mechanisms of crowd behavior, they remain strikingly similar.
And then when he starts talking about voters,
Yeah.
he says they're very easily swayed by things like a leader's prestige or using powerful rhetoric and those appeals to emotion.
It really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does.
Because it really speaks to the enduring relevance of Le Bon's work. Crowds, whether they're physically gathered in a single location or whether they're expressing themselves through something like a vote, are still susceptible to all of these basic psychological influences.
Which sort of leads to this bigger question. I mean, after reading this, you have to wonder, are we all just destined to be puppets of these charismatic leaders and their appeals to our emotions? Is there any hope of ever being able to make rational choices in a world where it feels like this crowd mentality is becoming more and more dominant?
I think that's the question that Le Bon leaves us grappling with. He certainly seems to be suggesting that while crowds have this immense power, that they're also incredibly open to being manipulated.
Not exactly a comforting thought, is it?
It isn't. And he doesn't exactly let us off the hook by giving us easy answers either. He just encourages us to be more aware of these dynamics at play, to try to be more critical thinkers, to question the information that we're being bombarded with. And I think maybe most importantly, to be aware of all the different influences that are shaping our perceptions, especially when we find ourselves in a group setting.
So it's kind of like that old saying, know thyself, but maybe with an addendum, know thyself and know the crowd.
I like that. I think that's a great way to put it. The more we understand how crowd psychology works, how all of these little mechanisms of influence play out on us psychologically, the more we can start to navigate even really complex social situations without getting swept away.
He also talks about crowds going through very distinct phases, doesn't he? There's that buildup, this intensity that kind of peaks, and then eventually a decline.
He does. Le Bon describes this fascinating progression in his book, talking about how crowds form, how they become increasingly unified in their beliefs and their emotions, and then finally how they eventually disperse. And it's really interesting because he uses all of this vivid imagery.
Yeah, and he compares these groups of people to organisms. He says they're like a living thing, going through their own life cycle.
Exactly. For example, in one passage, he talks about how crowds in their early stages are highly suggestible and impulsive, almost like children. He really drives this point home by using really vivid language and imagery.
And then he talks about how those early influences, those initial sparks, can really determine the direction a crowd takes.
Precisely. And it highlights how important it is to be able to recognize these patterns early on.
But, aside from that life cycle of a crowd, he also spends quite a bit of time examining how the anonymity that often comes from being part of a crowd, how that can either fuel certain behaviors.
Right. It's like people start to feel less inhibited, less accountable for their individual actions when they're just one face in the crowd.
Right. Like the normal rules of behavior are suspended, at least for a little while.
Exactly. And that's a really crucial observation that Le Bon makes. He argues that the anonymity of being in a crowd can lead to what he calls a diffusion of responsibility. People feel less restricted by their usual morals or social boundaries.
Which, let's be honest, can lead to those really ugly mob mentality situations where there's violence, but it can also lead to incredible displays of selflessness and even heroism.
You're exactly right. It's a double-edged sword.
It is.
And Le Bon acknowledges that. He says crowds are capable of both incredible good and incredible bad, And it really all just depends on the circumstances, what those initial triggers are, and the other influences that are at play in that moment.
Thinking back on the book, one of the things that has really stuck with me is this idea that he puts forth that the most effective leaders, they're not always the smartest people in the room. They're not always the ones who are thinking the most rationally or logically. Often they're the people who understand at a fundamental level how to persuade others, how to tap into those emotional undercurrents and really leverage them.
Right. Le Bon observed that a lot of times the most successful leaders when it came to crowds, they were really masters of reading and then manipulating people's emotions. They were masters of being able to create these really simple but really powerful narratives that resonate on this deep, almost visceral level, and then they use that to motivate people to take action.
So it's almost like in a crowd setting, logic and careful reasoning,
Yeah.
they take a backseat to emotion and instinct.
That seems to be very much what Le Bon believed. He saw crowds as being primarily driven by unconscious desires and emotions, which in his view made them particularly vulnerable to those leaders who understood how to tap into those primal forces that are at play.
Another thing that I thought was really interesting that really struck me was just how important Le Bon believed things like imagery and symbolism are when you're talking about crowds.
Absolutely. You're right. He observed over and over that crowds are incredibly responsive to those strong visual cues, to those easily recognizable symbols and potent metaphors. And he really firmly believed that those things could be far more persuasive than any logical argument or factual data.
It's like those images, those symbols, they become the sort of shorthand for this whole complex web of beliefs and values that are really difficult to put into words sometimes, but people, they just feel it so intensely.
Yes. And that is precisely what makes them such powerful tools for mobilizing crowds and for creating a sense of shared identity. It really bypasses the need for complex reasoning and speaks directly to our emotional core. It taps into those primal instincts that we all share.
So if we try to connect all of this back to the big picture, what does it all mean for us now? I mean, it's not like we're all just running around following charismatic leaders with torches and pitchforks, but it does feel like these dynamics that Le Bon was talking about are at play everywhere you look.
They really are. I think what Le Bon's work really highlights for us is how important it is to be very critical consumers of information, especially in this day and age.
Especially now, yeah.
Right. I mean, think about it. Every day we are absolutely bombarded with messages and narratives and people trying to grab our attention.
This is true.
And a lot of these things are deliberately designed to play on our emotions.
Let me get around that logical part of our brain.
Exactly. They want to bypass all that and just go straight for the gut in order to influence how we behave.
So we really need to be aware of what's going on. We need to be able to recognize those techniques that are being used against us, whether we encounter them in advertising or in politics or even just scrolling through social media.
Right, exactly. And the great thing is that even though he was writing more than 100 years ago, Le Bon gives us this incredible framework for understanding how those techniques work.
Which then helps us to be more discerning about the information we're taking in.
Right. We can start to recognize which messages we should be more skeptical of and which ones we should allow ourselves to internalize.
One thing I've been thinking about is this whole concept of prestige that Le Bon talks about. He seems to believe that certain people, even institutions or ideas, they just kind of have this aura of authority around them.
Yes.
And it's amazing how much that can influence what other people think.
It is. And Le Bon argues that this prestige, it can come from all sorts of places. It could be somebody's reputation, their social status, things they've accomplished in life, even just, their charisma.
And it's like we're almost hardwired to give more weight to the opinions of those figures or those ideas without ever really stopping to think why.
That's precisely what makes prestige such a powerful force. It really does operate on this subconscious level, totally bypassing our rational filters, appealing instead to this primal instinct to follow the people that we see as being above us in some way.
And Le Bon recognized that this could be used for good or for evil, right?
No, absolutely. It's not inherently a force for good or a force for bad.
Right.
He gives historical examples of both.
So he can inspire people to do incredibly courageous things.
Yes.
Amazing acts of selflessness, but it's also been used to justify some truly terrible things.
It has.
Oppression, discrimination, even violence.
Unfortunately, that's right.
So it's really just this tool that's always been there, this ability to influence large groups of people through perceived authority.
Yes.
And I guess that's why understanding how it works is essential, especially now when information can spread like wildfire and it feels like everyone is competing for our attention.
Absolutely. And the good news is that Le Bon provides us with that framework. And it's up to each and every one of us to take that framework and use it for the forces of good.
Yeah, exactly. We can be more discerning,
We can.
more conscious of how those dynamics are playing out around us every single day.
That's right.
And, it occurs to me that all of this deep dive into Le Bon's work, it's about so much more than just crowds in that literal sense, isn't it?
It is.
It's really about understanding ourselves as social creatures.
It is.
How we all fit into this broader fabric of different groups.
Yeah.
And how that ends up shaping what we believe and how we choose to act in the world.
You've hit the nail on the head. It really is a reflection on human nature, on our social instincts and how susceptible we are to having our beliefs, our choices, our very behaviors shaped by these really potent forces, especially when we're part of something larger than ourselves.
And that feels particularly relevant right now when you look at the political landscape in so many parts of the world. The way that certain figures use rhetoric and imagery, those massive rallies that feel almost electric. It's almost like you can see what Le Bon was talking about playing out on our TV screens and all over social media.
It's true, and that's what makes his writing so fascinating to return to. His observations, the things he was writing about more than 100 years ago, they're just as applicable to the world we live in today. They give us this really valuable framework for understanding things like how political movements take hold and the mechanisms by which propaganda actually works, the ways that leaders capture the imaginations of the public.
And it's so often the leaders who come from within those groups, right?
Very often, yes.
Like they understand instinctively the hopes and fears and frustrations that already exist within that population, and then they tap into that energy.
Exactly. They don't create these strong emotions out of thin air. They act as a mirror, reflecting back what people are already feeling, but in this really amplified, emotionally charged way.
Right. So it's almost like they're giving a voice to, and maybe a direction to, all these feelings that were already simmering under the surface.
Exactly.
Wow. So where does that leave us when it comes to individual responsibility? I mean, are we really just passive players in all of this, or do we actually have the ability to assert our own agency and make our own decisions, even when we're caught up in this kind of group setting?
Well, that is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is.
I think that Le Bon very much believed that while every single one of us is susceptible to crowd influence to some extent...
It's part of what it means to be human.
Right. It's part of our nature. That doesn't mean that we're powerless.
So there is a glimmer of hope.
I think there is. He seems to suggest that through things like education and really working to hone our critical thinking skills, that if we can develop a stronger awareness of our own psychological vulnerabilities, especially in group settings, we can become much more resilient. We're less likely to just be completely swept away.
So the more we understand these dynamics that are at play, the more we'll be able to make conscious, informed choices.
Exactly, and that's the goal, right? It's about developing that higher level of awareness that allows us to navigate all the complexities of these group dynamics without losing ourselves, without losing sight of who we are as individuals, or giving up our ability to make our own decisions that align with our values.
Well, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for that.
Yeah.
This has been incredibly eye-opening for me, I've got to say. It's given me a lot to think about. It really changes the way that I view my own experiences in crowds and groups, all of it.
It is a different lens, isn't it?
It really is. I'm going to be looking at things very differently from now on.
Yeah.
And, I think this is something that everybody should be thinking about.
I agree.
Especially now in this day and age when we're dealing with information overload.
Yeah.
And everybody and their brother is trying to influence us to get us to buy something or think a certain way or vote a certain way.
I agree. Le Bon's work, it really equips us with the tools we need to better understand ourselves, to better understand the world around us, and most importantly, I think, to better understand how to navigate this tricky territory of being part of a larger group, which includes those physical crowds, but also those virtual crowds that we find ourselves in almost constantly now.
It's true. Well, this has been an amazing deep dive. Thank you so much for all of that. And to all of you listening out there, I encourage you to take these ideas and continue to explore them. Le Bon's work, it's full of these really incredible insights that are every bit as relevant today as they were more than a century ago. And I think we can all agree that as we navigate this increasingly complex world, understanding the psychology of crowds, it isn't just interesting, it's absolutely essential. Welcome in, everyone. Today we're diving into some seriously mind-bending stuff with AI researcher Dr. Jose Bach.
Yeah, we're talking about the nature of reality itself, consciousness, artificial intelligence.
It's going to be a wild ride, so buckle up.
Basically, Dr. Back's big idea is that what we experience as reality, it's not the actual physical world, but a simulation.
A simulation created by our own brains. Kind of blows your mind, right?
It does. And we're going deep on two of his talks. One, a casual conversation, and the other, a more structured podcast interview.
Both fascinating in their own way.
And through both, Dr. Back, he doesn't just throw out this simulation idea and then leave us hanging.
Right. He breaks down why he believes this and what it could mean, for everything. How we see ourselves, artificial intelligence, even the nature of consciousness.
Totally. It challenges so much of what we take for granted.
So if we're living in a simulation, how's our brain pulling it off?
Mm-hmm.
It's not like we're all walking around with, wires plugged in or something.
Right, exactly. It's not the Matrix.
Yeah.
Dr. Back, he compares the brain to a data compressor.
Okay, data compression.
Yep.
I'm listening, but my brain might need to compress that analogy a bit.
Think of it like this. Every single second, your senses are getting bombarded with tons of information, right? Sights, sounds, smells.
It's a lot.
It is. And all of that is raw data. Your brain's job, it has to find the patterns in that data, like what's important, what's not, and then it creates a simplified model. And that model, that becomes your reality.
So it's kind of like a highlight reel, not the whole movie.
Exactly. It's efficient.
But also kind of freaky when you think about it. Instead of remembering every single detail, every leaf on every tree.
Your brain is like, yep, that's generally what trees look like, and moves on.
And that frees up space for other stuff.
Right, exactly. It's all about efficiency. And it's not just random, this system. Dr. Back suggests that there might be a universality hypothesis at play here.
Okay, universality hypothesis, another big word. What's that mean?
Basically, the idea is that brains, whether they're human brains or animal brains, they might develop similar structures when they're exposed to similar things in the world.
So my dog and I might experience the world really differently, but there's some overlap in how our brains actually process all of it.
Potentially. We're probably not having existential debates with our pets, but...
Not yet, at least.
Right. But there could be some shared foundation in how we perceive reality.
So then the question becomes, if it's all a simulation, why does my simulation feel so different from yours?
That's a great point.
Why do I love spicy food when some people think it's like torture? We're both running the human experience program, but our settings seem pretty customizable.
I like that, the human experience program. But you're right, those customizations, they come from our unique genes, experiences, memories, all of the things that shape our individual models.
Okay, so even with our differences, the way that our brain builds these models, the underlying process, might be surprisingly similar.
Exactly, and that's where Dr. Bach's analogy of the Hundefutter factory comes in.
Okay, the Hundefutter factory, lay it on me. I'm ready to clock in.
So imagine this. Each neuron, those tiny brain cells, they're like dogs in this factory.
My brain is a dog factory. I knew I liked dogs for a reason.
Right. And these aren't just any dogs, they're specialized. Each one has a specific job to do.
Okay, so what are they actually doing in there?
Some of the dogs, they bark signals to other dogs. Some receive those barks, and then you've got these other cells called glial cells. They're like the managers, making sure everything runs smoothly.
So I've got this whole canine operation going on in my head.
Kind of, yeah. And the barking, that's how the neurons actually communicate.
Sending signals back and forth.
Exactly. And the more those dogs bark together, the stronger their connection becomes.
So it's the more I do something, the louder those specific dogs bark.
Yes. And the stronger that connection gets, the more that behavior or skill or thought pattern, whatever, becomes ingrained.
Like training my inner dog team.
That's it. And it's just such a cool way to visualize this complex thing, this adaptable organ in our heads. But here's where things get really interesting, because Dr. Bach suggests that this same understanding of how the brain works, this pattern recognition, this learning through data compression, we can apply this to AI.
Okay, so we went from my brain as a dog factory building a simulation to the robots coming for our jobs.
Well, not robots exactly, but
that?
AI that learns in ways that might surprise you. Think about something like ChatGPT, right? Which seems so smart on the surface. But Dr. Bach would argue that it's actually a really, really sophisticated autocomplete system.
Wait, seriously? So all those times I've been blown away by ChatGPT, it's basically just really good at predicting the next word.
Pretty much. It's been trained on this massive amount of text data, finding patterns and probabilities in how words are used. It's not that it understands the meaning behind those words like we do. Not really. It's more like it's playing this really, really advanced statistics game.
Okay. That is both Impressive and slightly disappointing at the same time.
I know. But even if it's just stats, the scale at which these AI models work is incredible. Training something like ChatGPT costs millions of dollars in computing power.
Millions of dollars.
It's true. I mean, we're talking Hollywood film budget levels of investment.
I guess my brain's hundred futter factory is a little more cost-effective then.
For sure.
But seriously, that kind of investment for AI, it makes you wonder, what's the end game here?
It's the billion-dollar question.
Are we just building really, really good autocomplete? Or is this leading somewhere bigger?
That's what we're trying to figure out. And Dr. Bach, he has some really intriguing ideas and some that are kind of unsettling about where this might all be going. It might not be killer robots we need to worry about, but something much stranger.
Okay, now you've got me hooked. Stranger in what way?
Instead of picturing, like, humanoid robots taking over, Dr. Bach says, think more along the lines of these vast, interconnected AI systems.
Interconnected how?
Think systems so integrated into our lives that we're not just interacting with them, but we're almost living inside of them.
Living inside AI. Okay, that sounds like something straight out of a sci-fi movie.
Right.
But this is a deep dive, so I know it's probably more nuanced than that.
It's not about being physically plugged in, like in the Matrix or anything.
Okay, good.
It's more about our relationship to technology in general. Like, think about how connected you are already to your phone.
Oh, I know. I spend way too much time on this thing.
Right, but now imagine that connection amplified like 1,000 times over. AI systems managing things like traffic flow, healthcare, even personalized recommendations.
Okay, so AI is making our lives easier, but...
But it's also shaping our experiences in ways that we might not even realize, right?
Exactly. And if our brains are already in the business of creating these simulations, like we talked about, then how different is that from living inside AI's version of reality?
That's the big question, isn't it? And Dr. Bach would argue that this is precisely why understanding our own minds is so crucial, especially now.
Okay, I'm with you on that. Because if we don't even understand how our own brains work, how susceptible they are to influence, and how are we supposed to navigate this future where AI is calling more and more of the shots?
Exactly. I mean, think about how easily we're swayed by things like advertising or targeted content online.
Oh, don't even get me started. I swear my phone is listening to me.
Right. So now imagine AI systems that are specifically designed to understand and even predict those patterns in our thinking.
Like having a superpowered marketing team inside your head 24/7.
In a way, yes. And they're constantly refining their strategies based on what our hundefutter factories, as Dr. Bach would call them, are most likely to believe.
It's kind of terrifying when you put it like that. So what are we supposed to do? Should we all just unplug and move off the grid?
Well, Dr. Bach doesn't necessarily advocate for that. But he does raise some really important questions about the cost of intelligence itself. Like, he talks about how human intelligence, it took a really long time to evolve, right? And it left us super vulnerable in those early years as babies and children.
Yeah, we're not exactly born ready to take on the world.
Exactly. So he asks, is intelligence really the winning strategy in the grand scheme of things? Like, yeah, we've achieved some amazing things, but we've also created a lot of problems.
That we have. And now we're creating AI that could potentially outsmart us, maybe even outmaneuver us. It's kind of a scary thought.
It is. And the development of AI is happening at warp speed compared to human evolution. So Dr. Bach asks, are we really equipped to handle this? I mean, we're only just beginning to understand our own minds, let alone something as complex as AI.
It's a lot to wrap your head around. We've got brains simulating reality, AI potentially surpassing human intelligence, the future of consciousness itself. I'm not going to lie, my brain is kind of hurting right now.
I hear you. It's a lot to process. But to bring it back down to earth a little bit, how does all of this relate to, like, me, the person listening to this deep dive?
Yeah, how does any of this apply to my everyday life?
That's where things get really interesting, because Dr. Bach argues that understanding this idea of the illusion of the self, this concept we touched on earlier, it can be incredibly freeing.
Okay, rewind for me. How is realizing that my sense of self is an illusion
Yeah.
a good thing? It sounds kind of depressing, if I'm being honest.
It might seem that way at first, but think of it this way. If you're completely identified with every single thought that pops into your head, every fear, every insecurity, then you're kind of at their mercy, right?
Yeah, it's like being on a roller coaster that you can't get off of.
Exactly. But if you can start to see those thoughts and feelings as simply mental events, as simulations, and not necessarily the truth of who you are, then you gain some distance.
So it's less about being a passenger in my own head and more like I'm learning to drive.
Exactly. You're starting to take control of the steering wheel. And this is where Dr. Bach talks about those glimpses of transcendence that he's experienced.
Glimpses of transcendence. You're going to have to break that one down for me.
Have you ever had those moments where you're so absorbed in something, music, nature, a deep conversation, that your sense of self kind of fades away?
Oh, yeah, totally. Like when I'm playing guitar, it's like nothing else exists in those moments.
That's it. He says those are hints of what's possible, these moments of expanded awareness. And some spiritual traditions, through practices like meditation or mindfulness, they've been trying to tap into that more intentionally for centuries.
So you're saying that meditation isn't just about relaxation or stress reduction, but it could actually be about expanding our awareness to include this larger field of consciousness.
That's exactly what Dr. Bach is suggesting. And it's not just meditation. Even things like psychedelics, used in the right context, can induce these kinds of transcendent experiences.
Okay, got to pause there for a second. Just to be clear, we're not advocating for anyone to go out and experiment with psychedelics.
Absolutely. Critical thinking is key.
Safety first, people.
But the point is, if our sense of self is itself a kind of simulation, then maybe it's not as fixed as we think it is.
It's more like a work in progress.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Something that we can learn to work with more consciously.
Okay, my mind is officially blown again. So, to bring it back down to earth one more time, how does any of this help me deal with, like, the stress of daily life? You know, my to-do list, that tough conversation I'm dreading.
I love that you ask that because that's the power of all of this. It's not just some abstract philosophical debate. It can actually change how we approach our lives.
So how?
Remember those negative thought patterns Dr. Bach was talking
Right.
about? The ones where our brains get stuck in these unhelpful simulations?
Oh, yeah, like when I'm convinced that a presentation is going to be a total disaster before I even step foot in the room.
Exactly. And then it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right?
The worst.
But understanding that those thoughts are just that, thoughts, simulations, not facts, it gives you a little bit of wiggle room.
It's like realizing that just because my brain is telling me a story doesn't mean that story is true.
Exactly. You can choose to engage with those thoughts differently, maybe even rewire those thought patterns altogether.
It's like my inner dog team. They're used to running this one particular drill that always leads to the same outcome. But I can be like, okay, team, new drill, new outcome we're aiming for.
I love that. And Dr. Bach would argue that recognizing the shared nature of this simulated reality, how interconnected we all are, can also be a game changer.
Okay, interconnectedness. That's another one for the list of big words. What do you mean by that?
Well, if we're all running our own individual simulations, but those simulations are built on this foundation of shared laws of physics, shared biology, shared cultural influences even, then there's a common ground there, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, that makes sense. But how does that translate to everyday life?
He even goes as far as suggesting that there might be something like a collective consciousness that we're all tapping into.
Wait, hold on. Collective consciousness. Are we talking about telepathy now?
He's not talking about reading each other's minds or anything like that. It's more subtle than that. Think of it like, have you ever walked into a room and just felt a certain vibe? Or finished someone's sentence who you're really in sync with?
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's like when I'm jamming with my bandmates and it feels like we're all in this groove, tapping into something beyond just the individual parts.
Exactly. And he points to things like mirror neurons in our brains, which fire both when we do something and when we watch someone else do that same thing. It's like our brains are wired for connection, for shared experience.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
We are social creatures after all. But if there is this collective aspect to consciousness, what does that even mean for me on a daily basis?
That's the million-dollar question, and one that Dr. Bach leaves open-ended. But he does suggest that if our thoughts, our feelings, our actions, if they're all contributing to this larger field of consciousness, then our choices matter even more than we realize.
So it's not just about my individual simulation, but how that simulation interacts with and influences the bigger picture.
Exactly. And that's where things get really interesting because it ties into questions of ethics, responsibility, and the future of humanity in a whole new light. We're exploring this idea that our individual realities or simulations, they might be feeding into something much larger, this collective consciousness.
Yeah, and I got to be honest, part of me is still kind of like, okay, but how much of this is theoretical? How much is like backed up by actual science?
Totally fair question. And Dr. Bach, he's Not saying that it's definitively proven or anything, but he does point to some pretty interesting research. Like, he talks about how our Western culture, we tend to be so focused on individual achievement, right?
Yeah, the whole pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality.
Exactly. And he suggests that this hyper focus on the individual, it might actually be blinding us to these more subtle connections that exist between minds.
So it's like our obsession with me, myself, and I is preventing us from seeing the bigger picture.
It's a possibility, yeah. And he even points to other cultures, ones that place a stronger emphasis on community, on shared rituals, things like that. He suggests that they might be more tuned in to these collective aspects of consciousness.
Interesting. It's like we're so busy trying to stand out from the crowd that we forget that we're part of the crowd to begin with.
And that right there, that's the heart of it. If there's any truth to this idea of a collective consciousness, however it works, then it means that our actions, our thoughts, even our emotions, they all have this ripple effect. They go beyond just our own little bubbles.
Okay, so it's like my good vibes can actually impact the people around me, which is awesome. But then my bad day, could that actually bring everyone else down too? That's kind of a lot of pressure.
It's a both-and situation for sure. And Dr. Bach, he doesn't shy away from those ethical implications either. He actually argues that this is exactly why it's so important for us to be grappling with these mind-bending concepts, especially now as we're on the verge of all this new technology and advancement.
So it's not just about, like, pondering the mysteries of the universe for fun.
Not just that.
It's about how we treat each other, how we act in the world, knowing that we might be influencing this larger web of consciousness.
Exactly. It's like if you know that your actions are sending ripples out into the world, you're going to be a lot more mindful of what you're tossing into the pond, right?
That makes sense. But let's be real for a second. Even if I buy into this whole collective consciousness idea, most people, they're just trying to get through their day. You know, they aren't thinking about these grand universal concepts. So how do we bridge that gap? How do we take these big ideas and apply them to everyday life?
I think that's where it gets really practical. Dr. Bach, he suggests that certain practices like meditation, mindfulness, things that help to quiet the me noise, he says that these practices might actually be training our minds to tap into this interconnected space, this collective consciousness.
So it's not just about relaxation or stress reduction. It's potentially about expanding our awareness to include this larger field of consciousness, this interconnectedness.
Exactly. It's like we've been given these incredible brains capable of amazing things, but we're only using a tiny fraction of their potential.
It's true when you really think about it. Okay, so if we can train our brains to be more aware of this interconnectedness, what does that actually look like in the real world? I mean, what would that change?
That's the million-dollar question. It's uncharted territory in a lot of ways, but Dr. Bach, he hints at things like greater empathy, more ethical decision-making, even solutions to global problems that we can't even imagine yet.
So this whole deep dive, it wasn't just about questioning the nature of reality. It was about questioning what's possible for humanity, especially if we can learn to tap into this interconnected potential.
Exactly. It's a call to action in a way.
It is. And on that note, I think we've given our listeners a lot to chew on today.
Definitely. We've only just scratched the surface.
True. But if you're anything like me, your brain is probably already working overtime with all of these ideas. Big thanks to Dr. Joss Bach for giving us so much to think about. And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we'll catch you next time for another mind-bending exploration. Ever get that, like, eerie feeling? You know, when you're thinking about someone and bam, they call you right at that moment. It makes you go, whoa, a little, right? Well, hold on tight, because today we're cranking that feeling up to 11. We're talking twin telepathy, that mysterious link between identical twins. Get this, we're diving deep into a brand new study. It just came out in April from the Frontiers in Human Neuroscience journal. They wanted answers, hard proof, if possible, about what's actually going on in the brains of twins when they seem to be reading each other's minds. And spoiler alert, the way they did it is seriously cool. Picture this. They got these identical twins, ones who already swore they had some kind of telepathic thing going on and put them in separate rooms, totally isolated. One twin, the sender, they're looking at all these different images. Some are just, everyday stuff. But others, they were designed to get a reaction, make you feel something strong. Meanwhile, their twin, the receiver, they're hanging out in a totally dark room, absolutely zero clue what their sibling is seeing. Talk about a blind test, right? Now, here's where it gets really wild. To really get down to the nitty-gritty, the scientists use this technique. Get ready for it. It's called SSVEPERPC Yeah, no, I drew a blank too the first time I heard it. Luckily, we've got our expert here to break it down for us.
So imagine this. You're at a packed rock concert, music blaring, crowd roaring. And amidst all that chaos, you're trying to pick out the sound of a pin dropping. That's what SSVEPERPC is like. It's like a super-powered microphone filtering out all the extraneous noise, zeroing in on that one tiny sound. In this case, it's about isolating the brain activity specifically related to seeing those images, even though the receiver twin hadn't actually seen them. Pretty neat, huh?
That is seriously impressive.
Yeah.
So it's not just about whether the receiver twin's brain was doing something. It's about finding an exact match to what the sender was experiencing.
You got it. And remember how I mentioned they specifically chose twins who already believed in their own telepathy? Well, that adds a whole other layer here. There's actually a ton of research into these kinds of experiences in twins. And it suggests they might be more in tune with each other, more sensitive to this type of connection, you could say.
Yeah.
So the researchers weren't starting from scratch. They were diving headfirst into some pretty deep waters.
And hold on, everyone, because this is where things get really good. Did they find anything down there in those deep waters? Well, get ready to be amazed, because what they found was kind of shocking. When the sender twin looked at an image, especially those emotionally charged ones, the receiver twin often showed changes in their brain activity at the exact same time.
And that's the key right there, that synchronization. It wasn't just that both their brains were active, it was the timing that really made us sit up and take notice. If it was just random chance, we wouldn't expect those changes to line up so perfectly. But the fact that it happened precisely when the sender was looking at the image, that's a pretty strong hint that there's something more than coincidence going on here.
Okay, so it's like their brains were having a conversation, even across different rooms. Now, that's what I call a long-distance call. But as with all things science, there's a twist. Because while they found these brain patterns syncing up, they weren't exactly identical for every single twin pair they studied. And that, my friends, is where things get really interesting.
Yeah, and that's what makes this whole thing even more fascinating. If these connections are real, they're not just like a light switch, on or off. There's something more going on there, something unique to each twin pair.
So, okay, this is what really gets me thinking. Could this variability tell us how this connection works?
Yeah.
Like, are there any patterns they found?
That's the million-dollar question, right? It's like, we've got a few pieces of a puzzle, but no idea what the whole picture looks like. Maybe, and I'm just speculating here, but maybe twins who are super close emotionally, maybe their brain activity syncs up even more. Or maybe it's got something to do with shared experiences. It's wide open, honestly, begging for more research.
It's like they say, twice the fun, twice the mystery when it comes to twins. But speaking of mysteries, we got to address the elephant in the room. I mean, does this mean mind reading is real? Should I call up my twin and ask what I ate for breakfast yesterday?
Hold your horses. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, all right. This study alone, it doesn't prove mind reading, no. But it does make you think, right? It's pretty strong evidence that something interesting is definitely going on. It's not just random chance, that's for sure.
Right, it's not like they were both just thinking about pizza at the same time. Which, now that I mention it, kind of makes me want pizza. But anyway, what makes this research different from those old studies, like with the Zener cards?
Yeah.
You know, those cards with the wavy lines and the star. Those always seem kind of, I don't know, flimsy to me.
Oh, yeah, good point. Well, for one, this study used way more precise measurements of brain activity. Instead of looking for these big, obvious changes in brain waves, they were tracking these really subtle shifts happening at very specific times. Remember that rock concert analogy?
Ah, right. It's like they upgraded from those old headphones to a top-of-the-line sound system.
Yeah.
But why is that so important in this case?
It's all about sensitivity. With this new technology, they could pick up on stuff that might have been totally missed before. Plus, the effect they found in the study, it was pretty big, which means it wasn't just a fluke. It was a strong signal, something to really pay attention to.
Okay, so sensitive measurements, strong signal, anything else that makes this research stand out?
The fact that they specifically chose twins who already said they had this telepathic connection, that's really interesting too. They were very upfront about it. It wasn't about generalizing to all twins, but really zooming in on a very specific phenomenon.
I see. So where does that leave us? Are we close to having scientific proof of twin telepathy, or is it still in that, like, X-Files category?
Here's the thing about science. It's not always about finding absolute proof, but more about building a case, piece by piece. And this study, it's a pretty intriguing piece of the puzzle. It doesn't give us the whole picture, but it gives us something solid to work with.
It's like finding a scrap of a treasure map. We're not there yet, but at least we know we're headed in the right direction. And maybe it sparks even more questions along the way.
Exactly. For instance, think about this. In the study, they couldn't completely rule out the possibility that the twins were communicating somehow, even though they were apart. Even in separate rooms, there's always a chance, even a tiny one, that something could have tipped off the receiver twin.
Yeah, true, like maybe a cough or a sound through the wall. It happens. Which makes me wonder, what if they could make absolutely sure there was zero communication between them? Would the results be even stronger? That would be pretty convincing.
Absolutely. That's exactly why we need more research. To do it again, but even more carefully controlled, to see if this effect is real, even when you account for every little thing. That's how we separate those fun anecdotes from real scientific evidence.
And this is where my brain goes into overdrive. What if they took it a step further? Like, instead of random images, they used stuff that was really meaningful to each twin pair. Things only they would recognize. Could that, like, amplify the effect? Or maybe even show different patterns?
Now, that is a fascinating idea, and it gets to the heart of what this research is all about. It's not just about proving or disproving twin telepathy. It's about understanding what the human brain is truly capable of. We're talking about the limits of consciousness, of how we connect, what it means to be human. Pretty deep stuff.
I mean, it really makes you think, right? Like, what if there's actually something to this whole we're all connected idea? Could this twin telepathy thing be a clue to a deeper level of human connection that we haven't fully tapped into yet?
It's a pretty mind-blowing thought, isn't it? To think that we might have this whole other way of communicating, just waiting to be explored.
It's like we're talking about a sixth sense, but for, like, emotions and thoughts. But okay, let's say we don't all suddenly develop telepathic powers tomorrow.
Which, let's be honest, might be a little chaotic.
Yeah, could you imagine? But even if it doesn't go that far, think about the implications for psychology, for therapy, for just understanding each other better.
Absolutely. Imagine being able to really tap into someone's feelings, understand their perspective on a deeper level. It could change everything.
It's amazing to think that it all started with this study on twin telepathy. It just goes to show you never know where scientific curiosity might lead.
And to think, some people probably thought researching twin telepathy was a waste of time. But that's the beauty of science. You got to be willing to explore the unknown, even if it seems a little out there at first.
It reminds me of that saying, the only true wisdom is knowing you know nothing. Because honestly, when it comes to the brain, we've barely scratched the surface.
It's exciting, though, isn't it, knowing that there's still so much left to discover.
Totally. This deep dive has been a wild ride, from those tiny brainwaves all the way to the big, profound questions about what makes us human. We've explored a groundbreaking study, unpacked some serious science, and maybe even opened our minds to the possibilities of human connection. So, to everyone listening, keep that sense of wonder alive. The world is full of mysteries just waiting to be uncovered. Keep asking questions, keep diving deep, and who knows what amazing things you might find. Until next time.